Hey everyone, I'm back with some more Cat standard action. Getting ready to leave for Pro Tour Nashville here, and gonna leave you with one final video until after the Pro Tour. Last week I did a red-black aggro deck. This week I'm doing another red-black deck, just kind of by coincidence, just various things that I'm working on that seem pretty cool and are things that people aren't really talking about. So, last weekend was SCG Atlanta, which was the first tournament with Cat, and Blue-Red Thermo Alchemist got 9th, and this is a deck that I've thought, kind of suspected, could be good in a certain kind of format, and certainly with Saheeli gone, or rather Felidar Guardian gone, that the deck is actually, pretty good potentially. So Blue-Red is kind of nice because you have things like Fever Visions, which ensure that you have a lot of gas, and this deck is doing things a little bit differently and has like a light black splash instead of a blue splash. So one of the things you lose certainly is Storm Chaser Mage, but this deck kind of makes up for it. So you have an additional Madness card in Alms of the Vein, which is pretty nice with like your Tormenting Voices, and I have a couple Cathartic Reunions as well. And I think Alms helps to some degree. Like, basically what this deck is trying to do is burn its opponent out, but it's not trying to kill them on like turn 4, turn 5. Instead, it's basically like a board control deck that will burn your opponent out eventually, thanks to things like Cut Ribbons, and I have some Faith of the Devoteds, which are kind of sweet and want to try out. So I lost to a deck pretty similar to this in one of the Magic Online leagues, and I was like, oh yeah, this deck looks cool, and it looked like my opponent had figured out a lot of stuff that I still was kind of questioning about the archetype, like is red-black or red-blue better? And I think they sold me on red-black, mostly because of Faith of the Devoted. So like, I don't think this is a card that you can play a ton of, and it might look kind of strange because this deck doesn't have a lot of cycling cards. Like there's Canyon Slew, but mostly it is just like discarding things for profit with Lightning Axe, Tormenting Voice, Cathartic Reunion, and a card that you might not think of in Bedlam Reveler. Collective Defiance kind of does this too, but it's like, my problem with Bedlam Reveler was always that, like, if you draw a second copy, or if your opponent doesn't really like play along with you and like, play things that you can use removal spells on or whatever, like Bedlam Reveler can be really underwhelming. Obviously, if like your cards all line up pretty well, you get to interact with your opponent and then drop this at some point, then it's great. Especially if you don't have to give up a bunch of excess cards while you do it. Like if your deck is very good at getting Hellbent and then playing Bedlam Reveler, then like, yeah, obviously the card looks great, but a lot of the time it doesn't play out that way. Whereas in this deck, I think it does play out that way, because like a lot of your burn is just going to them, but also like even if it's not playing out that way and you have a bunch of excess lands, or like maybe the excess copy of Bedlam Reveler, it's like more cards to actually discard to trigger Faith of the Devoted. So sometimes it's actually just like a benefit. So that interaction really impressed me, and while I only have 2 of each, I think it's important to only have 2 of each just because they're both a little clunky in their own right, and the deck has some sort of clunker issues already where you have like Cut Ribbons kind of at the top end as like this late game fireball to finish your opponent off. So I do think that you can't afford to play too many clunky cards. You need like a certain amount of engine cards where you have cheap removal that also can target them to finish them off. So yeah, that's basically what I built around. So no creatures except for Thermo Alchemist and Bedlam Reveler, which is pretty nice, where they're kind of forced to keep in removal, but you don't have a lot of good targets, and the targets that you do have are either really cheap, like Thermo Alchemist, like this represents a really huge threat when basically half your deck is spells, and Bedlam Reveler is a card that just like beats spot removal kind of on its own. So they definitely have to keep in removal to kill your Alchemist, but it's like, it's still not really good if they do that. And plus you always have the threat of boarding in things like Glorybringer, which is a thing that I definitely think that you could do if you wanted to, but I chose not to. So yeah, use things like Lightning Axe. Generally Incendiary Flow is used on one of their first creatures, like hopefully a Scrap Heap Scrounger or something like that. Cut is pretty nice, and between Cut and Lightning Axe you have a lot of coverage against the more expensive threats in the format. Like you have the best ways of dealing with things on the cheap side, which is really nice. So you also have things like Fiery Temper and Incendiary Flow that can potentially help deal with Planeswalkers in addition to Thermo Alchemist if that actually gets a stick. So You're going to see here that I'm currently 1-1 in a league, and I'm going to finish off that league for the video instead of starting the first 3 rounds. And I kind of like that idea because at this point I've had a few games to play with the deck and kind of get acquainted with it. And so far I lost to a Bounty of the Luxa Teamer Marvel deck, which looked pretty good. And I won game 1 and lost the next 2 just to like getting marveled and like Woodweaver's puzzle knotted and stuff. So I feel like the matchup is probably fixable to some degree, so I learned some stuff there. And then the other one was against Black-Green Delirium, which I kind of just crushed, which I think this deck probably should. But that's my early impression of this deck, where it's like, you know, I've liked the main deck so far. One of the Smoldering Marshes should probably not be in here because there are just too many ETB tap lands, and just because you have access to a lot of different dual lands doesn't mean that you necessarily have to play them all. Like, the red mana eventually finds you black mana, and you don't really need a lot of black mana anyway, so like, you know, why are we playing all these dual lands, right? Like, I'm more concerned about my lands being tapped than I am with having the correct colors of mana. And by the time you want to cast Ribbons, you probably have like, you know, 6 to 8 lands in play already, so the odds that you can't make double black are very slim, especially since you have things like Tormenting Voice to sift through your deck and everything. So the sideboard, like, it was pretty easy for me to make a list of cards that I wanted to play, and then actually trimming it down to enough things was actually the difficult part. So the kind of go big package against people with just like a lot of life gain, or maybe counter spells, or yeah, like decks where your main deck is not like very effective. I have some Chandras. I think that's probably a better choice than Glorybringer, because they are kind of forced to keep in removal spells, and maybe they'll keep in things like Fatal Push, but board out Grasp of Darkness or whatever. But I think Chandra's like a nice additional threat that you can board in when the matchup dictates that you need more threats. So Chandra's a pretty good one, can effectively draw you extra cards or just add the extra mana. Like, the ritual effect is really powerful in this deck because you're going through a lot of cards and you have Faith of the Devoted, which is fairly mana intensive. So Chandra's pretty nice. Have an additional Bedroom Reveler, an additional Faith of the Devoted, and an additional land in Smoldering Marsh to help cast our bigger stuff. 2 copies of Sweltering Suns just for like small creature decks. I could see myself boarding this in against Mardu, for example, even though you might not need it because you have so much early removal. It's possible that these would be better served as Magma Sprays, but it just felt like I kind of wanted a sweeper to potentially clean up on like these clogged boards. And you know, zombies is a thing that's getting kind of popular, and Sweltering Suns seems a little bit better there than something like Magma Spray, but I could certainly be wrong. I have 2 copies of By Force for Mardu vehicles. There are a lot of matchups where Mardu is going to go lower on its artifacts, but I don't think that they can really afford to do that against this deck, so By Force is actually going to get them pretty good, I think. This could be Release the Gremlins, but I found that to just be too mana intensive. Like, there are certain decks where you're interested in grinding, where you might want Release the Gremlins, or you might want to play Release the Gremlins on turn 3 for the Manic Vandal effect and just kill an artifact and get a body on board. But with this deck, I feel like you can 1-for-1 most of their stuff and like actually just get a quick 2-for-1 with By Force that'll slow them down enough for you to take over the game. And at that point, you're more concerned about mana efficiency rather than making some extra values with 2/2s. So I think I like By Force instead. 2 copies of Scarab Feast, which was just kind of to like fill in the gaps and like have something for Black-Green Delirium, and cards like Liliana, Death's Majesty. I guess I could just look it up because I definitely have copies. Yeah, Death's Majesty. Okay. So yeah, like basically a deck like this, you know, if you're killing like turn 6, 7, 8, you're certainly worried about the people that are doing things that are more powerful than you. So like Aetherworks Marvel is a pretty good example of that, and some of the Marvel decks are Sultai with Liliana, and they just use that to reanimate Ulamog, and it seems like Scarab Feast was a low-cost thing that I could do that would interact with a lot of those things. And Delirium was not necessarily a matchup I was scared of, but it was like a matchup that I hadn't really thought a ton about and didn't really devote a lot of sideboard space to, so I thought Scarab Feast would fit in well, plus it has cycling, so, you know, it helps with Faith of the Devoted, and even if you're just like bringing in the extra Bedlam Reveler or whatever, having a spell that can cycle that makes this cost a little cheaper is certainly not the worst thing in the world. And then the last part is 3 Dispossess, which I really wanted for Aetherworks Marvel because that card's really scary. Their deck is generally a lot faster than you. Not only do they, generally just plan to outrace you, but like they also have things like Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot, which are going to slow your clock down by a turn or two. So having Dispossess actually just like take out their marvels, get rid of it. You don't have to worry about it. Hopefully, from there they have just like Whirler Virtuosos and stuff that they can cast. But as I said, the one that I played against was Bounty of the Luxo, which looked really good for my opponent and allowed him to just hardcast Ulamog in some games. So maybe Dispossess is not even the card that I necessarily want. Maybe it is just playing Transgress the Mind. But yeah, playing a discard spell in your burn deck is kind of awkward because obviously you want like this critical mass of burn cards, but against something like Marvel, you're not really nickel and diming them out. It is basically like you're going to kill them with Faith of the Devoted and the extra cards from Bedlam Reveler and stuff. So it's entirely possible that I could just have Transgress instead, and that would kind of cover my bases a little bit better. But Dispossess seemed like a focused hate card, and that was a matchup where I wanted a focused hate card. So that's it. Like I said, this is mostly just a board control deck that will eventually kill your opponent with burn. It is not just like a completely, like incendiary flow you on turn 2 deck or anything like that. But it's interesting. It's not the typical standard fare that you normally see with standard decks, and I think it's just like very clever to even figure out that you could build a red deck in this manner, So like this has been one of those things that I think was underappreciated just in general, and was one of the things I wanted to try out because the format's new. Felidar Guardian is gone. This is certainly one of the decks that was sort of kept in check by Saheeli. Not like this deck would have ran rampant if Saheeli didn't exist, but it was one of the things that certainly would have been an option, but since 4-color Saheeli was there, it just wasn't. Like, you just couldn't play a deck like this because your clock was too slow, you interact at sorcery speed a lot of the time, and the matchup, I think, was probably just bad. But now, with that gone, it's like, can this deck beat up on Mardu and Black-Green? I think it's possible, so that's what we decided to do. Let's give it a shot.